Where do we go today as a family? My first inclination was to do from Psalm 70. It's the last passage I read with Sue. Psalm 70 is actually the condensed version, the end of Psalm 40, a much longer psalm, which is a cry of desperation and a cry for help. In the midst of that is the security that we have in God. And I thought, well, no, maybe I'll do a passage that Brian alluded to in his prayer from Matthew 11, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." Where I settled was a very, very simple text. Simple words, and yet are very, very complex and profound. The depth of meaning of simple words. It's the text that children love to memorize. John 11:35. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Simple words. Profound and deep in their meaning. So I want you to go to John chapter 11 this morning. We're going to set the story. It's a familiar story that children learn in Sunday school, and if they're around here long enough, we'll hear this too. John chapter 11 is the familiar story. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Now, John chapter 11 is the culmination of a series of miracles. John's gospel is built around 7 miracles. When John writes the purpose of his gospel, he says, look, there were many other signs, many other miracles Jesus performed, that if I were to try to write them all, there'd be more books than you could shake a stick at. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. He said, look, I selected these miracles out to demonstrate that Jesus is the Christ, he's the Messiah, that he's the Son of God, and that by believing you'll have life in his name. And so there are 7 miracles that he selected. Those 7 miracles work through the first 11 chapters of the Gospel of John. The last one is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. The first was the turning of water into wine in John chapter 2. And there's this kind of building to this climax. When you get to chapter 12 to the end of the Gospel deals essentially with the last week of the life and ministry of Jesus. The first 11 chapters are the 3.5 years. And so this is that culmination to show us who Christ is. So I want to read the account. I'm going to read the account. I know it's familiar. There was a certain man who was sick. His name was Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. Now that event is going to be in chapter 12. So John's including this and said, look, this is the woman I'm going to tell you about in chapter 12. It was their brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sister sent word to him saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. And when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard he was sick, he stayed there 2 days longer in the place where he was. Odd. After this, he said to the disciples, "Let's go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going to go there again?" And Jesus answered, "Aren't there 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he doesn't stumble, because he sees the light of the world. If anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." And then he said after that, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep, so Jesus had to speak to them plainly. A little slow these guys are. Lazarus is dead. And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. And Thomas, who's called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Well, let's go too, so we can die with him." And when Jesus came, he found that he'd already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. And Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." "Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "Well, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day." She believed Daniel chapter 12. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? And she said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God." See, that's why John's writing his gospel. See, these are written that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and have life in his name. You're the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. And when she said this, she went away and called Mary, his sister, saying secretly, "The teacher's here, and he's calling for you." He's saying, "Come, come." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. And Jesus had not yet come into the village, was still in the place where Martha met him. And the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." Very same thing that Martha said. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man," chapter 9, "have kept this man also from dying?" So Jesus again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it, and Jesus said, "Remove the stone." And Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by this time there's going to be a stench. He's been dead 4 days." And Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone, and Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And the man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. And he said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary saw what he had done and believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, "What are we doing? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away our place in our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." Now, he didn't say this on his own initiative. But being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. We're going to get to that Jesus wept. But there's some things that are perplexing even in the beginning of the story. Jesus, the guy whom he's sick, the one who that you say he's really sick, the idea is, Lord, come. Come, you can take care of him. If you hadn't been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus says, this isn't just about this. This is for that God is glorified and the Son of God is glorified. And he waits 2 more days. If you see this, he loves him. He loves him. Why doesn't he go right away? Look, if you love somebody and you got word that they were sick, almost dying, what would you do? Wouldn't you drop everything and go? Jesus doesn't. Now, lest we think that the delay indicates that he really doesn't love Lazarus and Mary and Martha, we're mistaken. He loves them. It's very evident. So why? Why wait? I think twofold. This idea, this sickness is not just about death, but for the glory of God, the Son of God may be glorified by it, is central to the answer. The waiting was to fulfill a greater purpose. Was to fulfill a greater purpose expressed 2 ways. God's glory, for the Son of God to be glorified. And this is how, 2 ways. Number 1, after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, there were people who believed. There were people who believed the sign. Now listen, let me help you out. Okay, 4 days. 4 days we're told he was in the tomb. Is there any significance to that? Possibly. You see, there's a rabbinic myth, there's a rabbinic legend, a rabbinic tradition. Some of the rabbis, particularly we see this around the 3rd century, and probably it may have come from an earlier understanding, but there was this rabbinic tradition that when somebody died, their soul hovered around the body for about 3 days, okay, waiting to see if maybe it might re-inhabit the body, give it life again. So for the first 3 days, the soul kind of stays close, just in case it's kind of like, well, they can come back again. The 4th day, it left because decomposition would have started to set in, and so when the body started to decompose, they said the soul would say, no, time to go. Okay? Jesus waited 4 days. It's not that Jesus, in waiting 4 days, says that myth is true. Okay? But by waiting 4 days, there may have been those around who thought like that. And so when Jesus comes back, and on the 4th day, everybody outside that tomb clearly understood this. Lazarus was dead. See, that's why there's a stink. If you move the stone, it's going to smell. Decomposition had set in. He is dead. Jesus raised him from the dead, and people believed. See, the glory of God and the Son of God is glorified. See. He waited for a greater purpose. That greater purpose, even though it meant for Mary and Martha pain, suffering. Even though it meant for them dealing with grief and the loss of their brother. God's purpose doesn't exclude suffering. The second way in which the Son of God is glorified is not just by the acceptance of some, it's by the rejection of others. Because of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, the Pharisees convene a council. They said, this has gone far enough. If we keep letting this go further, everybody's going to be following this guy. We need to do something. And Caiaphas doesn't realize what he's saying. He said, hey, it's more expedient for one to die than the nation. Not realizing that what he's actually saying is this. Listen, this plot for a way for this man to die. And John says, through the death of that one man, it was not only for the nation, it was for others as well. What Caiaphas was saying is that through the death of Christ, there would be a ransom, a redemption for more than the nation of Israel, but to those even beyond the nation of Israel. So what you see in the rejection of the Pharisees is the accomplishment of the purpose and the will of God so that Jesus would suffer and Jesus would die. See, that the Son would be glorified, that the Father would be glorified through the redemptive work of Christ. The greater purpose, the death of Lazarus, and yeah, he could have gone. Yes, he could have gone. He could have healed Lazarus. But two purposes. Through the raising of Lazarus from the dead, there are people there who believe in him as the Messiah. And secondly, there are those who say, because of this, we will now execute him. We will now put into play the plan to kill him. And through the death of Christ, this man delivered up by the predetermined plan and forecounsel of God, they nailed to a cross. Sometimes we don't understand the purposes of God, why God's doing what he's doing. Could God have intervened in Sue's case? Yes. In Debbie's case? Yes. In Pat's case? Yes. By the way, they're not the only ones. There are other family members of Faith Bible Church who are going through really tough times. Got a family of a 34-year-old son who's diagnosed with ALS, 3 to 5 years to live. Going through a tough time. Another one with MS. Another one struggling with some of the struggles of their kids. And there are people going through very difficult times. Could Jesus? The answer is yes. But he chooses to take a path that sometimes includes the suffering of his children to accomplish an even greater glory. Even greater glory. The account goes on and talks about how Jesus gets here and Mary and Martha, his encounter with Mary and Martha. And then we get to the heart of what we are. Jesus wept is bookended by two other emotional terms regarding Jesus. Verse 33, When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, let me tell you, that's a different word, weeping, that you see in verse 35. The weeping in here are those for Mary and Martha, and those are wailing. It's a lament. They're mourning very loudly, profusely. I did a service, graveside service, for a brother from here earlier this year. One of the unexpected ones. And as we were concluding the graveside, there was a group that were over a little further. As they stood at the grave, they were wailing, weeping very loudly, very profusely. And it was a reminder of those who mourn as those who without hope. Here, Mary and Martha are wailing. It's not, they're just, their grief is being poured out, and they're probably friends with them, and then they're professional mourners. They all had people who were expected to come and mourn. But that weeping here is not the same word you see in John 11:35. It's a different word. But then Jesus is deeply moved in spirit and is troubled. And then you see that again in verse 38. Jesus again deeply moved. Those two terms, deeply moved, bookend Jesus wept. And there's a contrast. To understand the deeply moved, it really means indignant. Jesus got angry. In fact, it says he's deeply moved and was troubled. The idea, the pictures there, is that Jesus is so intensely, emotionally moved, he's shuddering. He's literally shaking his anger. That emotion is so raw at this point in time, on two occasions, bookends. That raises another perplexity. It's like, well, why is he so angry? What is it that's causing him to shudder? Some would argue because maybe of all these mourners, that Jesus is angry about their unbelief, that their lack of faith, their denial, even though they've said, we believe he can raise from the dead, that there's this expression of their unbelief, and Jesus is indignant about that unbelief. I'm not so sure that's it. It may be part of it, because that unbelief is an expression of something else. I think it's tied to his anger at seeing what sin and death does. As Jesus confronts sin and death, his spirit is so deeply angered, it moves him to indignation. And I think that's related to Jesus wept. The weeping here is a silent cry. It's the tears that are now running down his cheek. I told the first hour, I said, this is something they would probably relate to and remember more than everybody in the second hour. It's a TV commercial. So the younger ones, you probably don't remember this. The image of an Indian, a Native American Indian, standing alongside the road on a highway with all the pollution. And as he stands there, he looks and these tears are running down his cheeks. Do you remember that? See, some of you remember that. You're as old as I am. That's this. That's Jesus looking, and now the emotion. Tears making their way down his cheek. And John says it so simply. Jesus wept. And yet it's so complex. You see, it's a demonstration of his humanity. Now, theologically, in John's gospel, John has been arguing, he said, that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And by that, he certainly means that Jesus is the King, but he also means that Jesus is divine. See? It's been very important to John in his gospel to set forth the case that Jesus is God in the flesh. He's God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. No man has seen God at any time, but the Son has fully made him known. John, in his gospel, is saying Jesus of Nazareth is God. And now he says he cries. For the Greeks, gods don't cry. Gods don't enter into human emotions. John says our God cries. See, our God, Jesus, is the God-man. It's an expression of his humanity. Yes, it's a mystery. Fully God, fully man. We sometimes, when we're interviewing guys for elders, one of the questions that's become the stock question, everybody now says, okay, we're going to ask this. Define or describe the hypostatic union. What is the hypostatic union? The hypostatic union is the relationship of the two natures of Christ. Fully God, fully man, existing in one person. Mystery. How does that work? So John is, as full as he is to talk about the deity of Christ, he gives us these pictures of the humanity of Christ. He gets hungry. He eats. He sleeps. He cries. Jesus weeps. To point us to a God who is like us. He's a man. And so Jesus wept as a demonstration of his humanity. It's thus, therefore, secondly, one demonstration of one who truly sympathizes with us. It's one who has tasted the very pain of the human experience. Isaiah 53 and verse 3, and one we often are familiar with, and certainly it applies to the sufferings of Christ himself. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Speaks of his own sufferings, but yet at the same point in time it says, look, he's a man who understands sorrows and grief, even of others, because of his own experience. He's one who can truly sympathize and enter into that compassion with us, because he didn't run a different path. He walked the same road that we walk. He experienced in his life the very same pains of life, griefs of life that we experience. He can sympathize with us as he walks through that because of this. Sometimes we talk like this. We said, we're one body, we're one family, we're one body. When one member hurts, we all hurt, right? Isn't that the analogy in Paul's writings? When one member hurts, you all hurt. Okay? And like the body, hey, if this thumb hurts, something else hurts. Okay? And when we relate to that as body members. Well, let me help you out. There's an important member of the body. It's called the head. When you hurt, the head hurts. When you cry, the head cries. You understand what Paul in Romans chapter 12 and talking about the body and the gifts of the body also says this? Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. Jesus hasn't surrendered his humanity. Jesus says he enters into his compassion and his sympathy with us. When we cry, he cries. He mourns with us. Thirdly, comes back to that anger. The human experience includes the ravages of sin and death and the pain that it inflicts on the child of God. Jesus weeps. He weeps when he sees that relationships of people, his people who love each other, when those relationships are tattered and torn by sin and by death. He weeps. When death causes our faith to be tested, even like Mary and Martha's faith was tested, but in the darkness and the hard times, sometimes our faith and our doubts assail us. When we wonder, God, why didn't you do something? Christ, if you could do this, why don't you do it? He cries when he sees that sin impacts relationships externally. He sees and he cries when he realizes the ravages of sin can even afflict us internally. And you see what sin and the curse of sin and death does to people when it takes them and makes them somebody else that you never don't even recognize. And your last memory of that person is something else other than the beauty of their picture. You get angry at what sin does to you. And Jesus cries. Jesus wept. His sympathy is not merely a passive, standoffish expression. His sympathy is an active expression of his grace. You see, Jesus' sympathy provides grace to us. His weeping here are tears of grace. It's the demonstration of who Jesus really is. His tears are tears of grace. John 1. We beheld his glory, glories of the only begotten of the Father, full of what? Grace. And John says, and grace upon grace and upon grace. In Jesus' face is the grace of God on display. And when those tears roll down his face, they're the tears of grace. Jesus is wanting, through his sympathy, not to send a card, but to give grace, the extension of his person, who he really is. Pouring out of his soul so that he may extend his grace to us. It's a grace that can be a balm for the soul. Provide that balm, provide that comfort for the present. It's a grace that certainly applies to the certainty of our faith, that takes what we think and what we believe in our faith and now adds substance to it to make it more than just faith, to add to it and make it hope. And so when we look to Jesus, and we see Jesus weeping, there are really three looks. When I see Jesus wept, there are three looks. There's a backward look because he did die. He did provide a redemption. He did provide a salvation through his death to fulfill the purposes and the plan of God. He, by his grace, died, that the grace of God appeared, that he might bring life and salvation to man, is what Paul says in the book of Titus. I look back, and in the tears of Christ, I see he died for me. In the tears of Christ, I look up. And I look up, I see one who is a faithful high priest who has passed through the heavens, who stands at the throne of grace and says, "Come, come, come, sinners, poor and needy. Come, those who are heavy laden. Come, come and receive mercy and grace to help in time of need. Come." I see one who pleads my case. I see one who is my advocate, one who is my intercessor, and one who is my faithful high priest who provides a comfort for me that no one else can. Hallelujah, all I have is Christ. And I look forward. When I see Jesus wept, I look forward because now that faith, those promises now have substance. I do know, because he died and because he was raised again and he stands at the throne of the Father, that now that certainty of I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me shall never die but shall live even if he dies. That's true. So I look forward. I look forward. Jesus wept, and I can look forward to know that there is a resurrection from the dead. The grace of God is on display fully in those tears of Christ. The grace of God is also on display in the body of Christ. That's us. Many times we become the means of that grace displayed to others. Opportunities for you to come alongside Danny and his family, and to come alongside Tom and his family, and whatever opportunities we have for the Kirbys and others who I said who are here, who are going through very difficult times. You become a means of grace, of the tears of Christ for them. Don't shy away. And when people come to share with you, don't push them away. They want to share the grace of Christ with you. This will be a tough week. The tears haven't stopped. The psalmist says he takes our tears and he collects them and puts them in a bottle and he keeps record of them in a book. He's aware. Jesus knows how many tears we shed, if you'll allow me to say this, because he sheds them too. And so as a family, as we grieve, our head, our chief shepherd walks with us, holds our hand and hugs us and whispers in our ear, "I'm here for your grace, to give you the grace that you need right now." Let me say this. If you're here this morning and you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, that invitation to you is, "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy." Your first need is to know the grace of God that redeems you, that takes care of the ravages of sin and death. Yes, hey, it wins the skirmishes, but we've won the war. And we want you to know that. We want you to know how you might have victory over that too.